Hi, I'm Dennis Worwood, retired USU Extension agent and a longtime gardener. And today we're going to talk a little bit about compost. Now, while I was working for Extension, I used to get several calls a year from people who are trying to make compost. And they were worried about being able to do it. And while there are certain things that we can do to be more successful, to help it break down more rapidly or to get a more complete breakdown, what I used to tell them was to reassure them was that if they wanted to do something really challenging, they should pile up some organic matter and try to stop it from breaking down, because that's what's going to happen. So the first thing you could know about composting is one option is simply to scatter organic matter on the soil surface and either leave it or till it in. That's called sheet composting. And the soil bacteria and organisms will take care of the job. It might take a little while, but it'll certainly happen. But we're going to talk about piling it up, and you can buy various structures or see plans for structures to put compost in, and all of those are handy. Some of them are wire cages, you have tumblers, you have all sorts of things, and those are all options. In this particular instance, we're generating quite a bit of bedding that needs to be composted from some livestock, and so we've chosen simply to pile it. And so behind me are two piles, one pile that's further along in its stage of decomposition and one pile that's fairly fresh. And so if you look on this shovel, you can see compost that is most of the way decomposed. I could either use this now, especially as a mulch, and which is what I'll probably do, is weed a flower bed and then put this down as a mulch. But I could also wet this and turn it again and let it compost further. And if you leave it long enough, it will break down into basically just brown dust-looking material. But this is fairly far along. You can see by the color that there's been quite a bit of decomposition taking place. So to talk about what you need to do to make this happen, I want you to imagine that you're going to raise livestock on the moon. What would you need to provide? The first thing that comes to mind is you would need air. And the reason I set this example on the moon is that there's no oxygen, and we often forget that in our compost pile air is a vital component. And so we need to have some air and oxygen in our pile. And if we don't, if we exclude air, either through adding too much moisture or compacting or whatever, then decomposition will still take place, but it will be of a less desirable type. And what we'll end up with is basically silage or sauerkraut, if you will. The anaerobic organisms will take over, and they will decompose it after their fashion. And it would still be usable, but it's likely to produce some odors that neither you nor your neighbors would appreciate, and it won't be the exact product that you desired to begin with. Also, it won't generate the heat that we like to see in a compost pile. Now, if we have air in the pile, then we get the right kind of bacteria and fungi and other organisms that are going to do the job for us. So that's the first thing. Second thing we would need if we're going to raise livestock would be water. And in this arid environment here in Farron, Utah, which receives about 8.5 inches of annual precipitation, water is usually the limiting factor. I have more difficulty in keeping the pile moist enough than in having it be too moist, which is probably the issue in other parts of the country where they receive more rain. So it needs air, needs moisture, and then you need to feed them. And so if you think about what a livestock would need, they would need a source of protein and they would need a source of calories. And it's the same for the little livestock that we're growing in our compost pile. They need a protein source and they need an energy or calorie source. And so in terms of composting, we usually talk about those as greens and browns. Greens are the protein sources and browns are the carbohydrate sources. And if you read literature on it, they'll talk about providing a mixture of greens and browns. Now, if you don't have the right amount of protein, say, in your pile, then composition will still take place, but it will be much slower. And so if you've got too much brown material, such as wood shavings or chips or dried out grass clippings or straw, they have very little protein or nitrogen in them, and they would break down quite slowly because that protein lack would be the limiting factor. And so if you build a pile and it doesn't take off, chances are you might have not enough of the green material, not a nitrogen or a protein source. That's one thing. The other thing I would look at is maybe it's too dry. If you build a pile and it starts to work and it has a really bad odor, then that might tell you that you have too much nitrogen. For example, if you've ever taken grass clippings and sealed them up in a garbage bag and left them for a couple of weeks and then opened the bag, you'll be able to tell very quickly that there's decomposition taking place there, but probably not the kind you want. That is more of the silage or sauerkraut type thing. If you're getting a bad odor out of the pile, chances are it's either too wet or it doesn't have enough carbohydrates. So in that case, I would add some of the brown material, dried leaves, wood shavings, those sorts of things. So those are just a few little things that we can look at, but those are the basic things that you need to make it go. Air, water, a source of protein or nitrogen, and a source of calories or carbohydrates. And if you have those things in a compost pile in the right balance, it will take off and heat up, and very quickly you'll be able to see that there's activity going on there. All right, we're going to build a compost pile, and again we need to provide for air, water, carbohydrates or source of energy for the organisms, and for protein or nitrogen. And so here we have a pile that's made out of shavings. It's been used for livestock bedding. Now this will have some nitrogen in it because it's been of the urine and the feces that's in it, but it may not be enough to really promote active decomposition. So it would be best as we mix this to provide a protein or a nitrogen source. But we can do it in layers, and this would be the same whether it's just a pile like this or whether you've got it in some sort of a bin made out of wire or old pallets or cinder blocks or whatever you want to use. So we'll go ahead and start. And so I'd begin by just piling up a layer, and it could be greens or browns. So this is brown, which is the carbohydrate. And we'll start with a layer of that. And then I need to add water. And I'm going to add not so much that it's saturated, but have it be about as wet as a damp wrung out sponge. And in this climate, again, water is probably the most difficult thing to provide and manage, because these piles, when they heat up, give off water. And they'll actually, in the winter, when it's cold, you'll actually see them steaming. So I've got a layer of material here, and it's mostly brown. Now, I should also mention that this is wood chips and shavings, fairly fine material, so that will help it break down because there's so much surface area for the organisms to attack. If I'm using larger material, like these stems, they would eventually break down, but it would be much slower. So if you have a way to break things up, that would be helpful. And again, browns could be anything like these wood shavings, could be dried grass, could be straw, could be old dead leaves, things like that. Dead material from the garden. The only caution with any of the garden materials is, one, you don't want to put anything in the pile that has seed, especially weeds. because the heat may not be enough to kill the seeds, and you don't want anything that's been diseased. So if you have diseased vegetable plants, you wouldn't want to put them in the compost. But if you have weeds that have not got seeds on them, or vegetables that are not diseased, they could be put in the pile. So I have a layer of browns. Now I'm going to add some greens, which is going to be my protein source, and this is fresh grass clippings. And I will just add a layer like that. And I don't want to get these grass clippings too thick because they tend to compact and they exclude air. And even though these are green, I'm going to add just a little bit of water. Not a lot, but enough to make them damp. I'm going to dampen some of this material that I'm going to pull off of this pile, this fresh material that's on the outside. And then we're going to scatter another layer of brown material. Now, we'll talk about what to do if you don't have a ready source of protein or of the nitrogen. And sometimes we don't have material like these grass clippings to work with. So I'm going to wet this. There's a pretty simple solution for that, and that is you add some other material that is either high in protein or that contains nitrogen. Now, if I wanted to do it organically, I could probably use something like soybean meal or other plant-based material that was fairly high in protein. Soybean meal is about 46% protein. But short of that, this is just nitrogen fertilizer. This is ammonium sulfate. If you're not opposed to a synthetic fertilizer, you can just scatter a little bit of that on the pile, and then you could add another layer of your brown material and wet it. Now, again, with the grass clippings, I'll incorporate them. We'll get this a little bit damp. And so on. I'll put some more grass clippings here. Now, within a couple of days, this should be heating up. And I have a compost thermometer right here that's been in this pile. And if you look at that dial, it's about 130 degrees down in the pile there. And that's without, all that is really a pile of shavings and livestock waste. There hasn't been any green material added. So it'll show you how rapidly that can heat up. And again, if this is winter, within a couple of days, the pile would probably be getting off quite a bit of steam. So after it's heating, it will heat, and then eventually it'll cool down and you can turn it. Now, if you have a compost tumbler, you can crank the tumbler and it will turn it periodically as you need to. And the purpose of turning is to add air into it and also to remix the materials so you have different materials in contact with each other, which will hasten decomposition. On this pile, the way I would turn it would basically be to turn it inside out. So I'd move the pile from this place over to another place. I would do so by taking all the material off the outside and starting with that, so that ends up in the center of the pile, and then the stuff that's in the center of the pile will end up on the outside of the pile eventually. It's a little bit laborious, but you can turn it once or twice or 3 times depending on how far you want the breakdown to go, and each time it will heat up a little bit less. And finally, your main decomposition toward the end will not be bacteria or other organisms that produce a lot of heat, but it will be mostly fungi and molds and things like that. But that's all there is to the compost. Now, again, if your pile doesn't heat, chances are it's either too dry or not enough green material or a nitrogen source. If it has a bad odor, it's probably either too wet or perhaps does not have enough brown material or enough carbohydrates. So you would remedy that in the first case by either adding more water or more green material or a nitrogen fertilizer or nitrogen source. In the second case, if it's got a bad odor, you would add more brown material, which could be anything you could get a hold of, straw or dead leaves or whatever, dried plant material basically. If we're talking about how to apply compost, you would add it like you do any other organic matter. So it could be used as a top dressing you put on the soil. It could be tilled in. It could be used as a mulch. And some of this compost that we have here, which could probably be further composted in a pile, because I need more mulch material, I'm actually going to apply it between plants in flower beds and elsewhere. So it could be used in a variety of ways. Now, with any compost, including some that you may buy, there's always a danger that there's enough unbroken down material in it that it will create a deficiency of soil nitrogen. And I've seen that even with commercial compost where people have applied a thick layer and tilled it in and their plants did not do well. The first concern might be that there were some salts in the compost, but in several cases I've seen where they're actually created a nitrogen deficiency. So just be aware that if I put on a real thick layer and my plants look pale and don't grow very well, I've probably got to add some additional nitrogen because the compost is still breaking down and the organisms are competing with my plants for the nitrogen. But over the long haul, compost will help your soil structure. It makes clay soils easier to work. It aerates them, and it also will work on sandy soils, making them hold more water. And basically what's happening, especially with the clay soils, is as these materials break down in the soil, they reach a point where there are some compounds in the compost or in the organic matter that don't break down very readily. These are gums and resins and things like that. And these byproducts of the organic breakdown actually start gluing the soil particles together. So if you have a tiny microscopic clay particle and you have those resins in the soil, several of the clay particles glued together, and now I have a larger particle, a composite particle, and that larger particle then begins to behave more like a sandy soil. In other words, there's more pore space in the soil, water will infiltrate more easily, and it makes the soil easier to work for that reason. So organic matter is good for your soil. It feeds the beneficial organisms in the soil, and compost is an organic material that's kind of had a head start because of the effort you put into compost it. Okay, again, compost is not too difficult to make. Just keep in mind that you're basically setting up a farm for microorganisms like bacteria and fungi and other things that will break down the plant material, provide air, moisture, a source of carbohydrates or energy, and a source of protein, and they will do the work for you. So good luck with your compost.